Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 16. I should have guessed that Edna would watch her mother. If there was anywhere in this world that I would show up to learn about Edna, it was this house. Fiat Lux caught me inside the kitchen. Her men drove up in a black van because all vans were black in those days. The dog's barking warned me seconds before the resounding stutter of a Tommy gun. I didn't know if it was the dog or Joe that had just been shot, and I feared equally for both. On hearing the shots, I did what any sane ex-soldier would do on hearing gunfire, so I threw myself to the floor. Two thugs hurled in the back door as two came through the front. Mrs. Clark sat there, both hands together, loudly praying something from Psalms while I put my hands over my head. Those men weren't stupid. They patted me down, hauled me up, then shoved me out the front door. What remained of the dog lay there on the lawn without a head, but Joe was nowhere to be seen. His car wasn't as lucky, gasping out the last of its steam as if in apology. I tried to hold them off, the car seemed to say. They pushed me into their truck, locking me into the back. Riding in the back of a Model T truck is about as miserable as it sounds. I felt every bump, every sway, and every jitter. Henry Ford made a durable vehicle, not a comfortable one, especially as the driver raced along, presumably taking the highway back north. I hoped that they would get there soon. If I didn't get rattled to death, I was going to boil. There was no air back there and no water. What would Joe do? He'd phone the Baroness. He'd phone Cymbeline. He'd let everyone know except Fate. They would work out a plan. What that could be, I didn't know. Who could tell where I'd be? They'd have to wait. There was nothing else that they could do. They would need to help Mrs. Clark. Having someone shoot up a dog in a car would bring the police. I thought that Mrs. Clark would be all right because Joe would step up and keep the cops at bay, and then the Baroness would call the governor or something. She had all the right connections and enough money to make the problem go away. As for Fate, she would figure out that something was wrong soon enough. What could she do? I didn't think that there were any loopholes that Fiat Lux would accept her exploiting in their favor. As a churchman, Mel might be able to do something, but given Fiat Lux's extremism, I doubted that even he could help. Given all the effort that they had just gone through, my bet was that Fiat Lux wanted me alive. Assuming that I survived this trip, I would be okay. We stopped once to take a rest. One guy tied a rope around my neck, then told me to piss on a tree. Once out of that truck, I found myself soaked in sweat from head to toe, blissful with the cool shade. Being late June, there was still some breeze to rescue me from the weather. I stood there after I was finished, just letting myself feel the cool until the thug pulled my leash. Back in, he ordered. Back in. I didn't want to go back in. In there was death. But they didn't let me stand there quibbling. They removed the rope just before shoving me in. In case I got any ideas, the second guy had a long knife, perfect for skewering in tight places. No, I wasn't going to fight back. We traveled for a ways after that. From the light squeezing in around the boards, I figured that we were heading west towards the mountains. I felt thirstier now, thirstier than I had ever felt before. My body cried for water but would not cry. I relaxed as I could, clearing my mind. I let my brain wander, where it seized upon days that I had forgotten about, I suppose because the swelter reminded me of hot train cars. It had been the autumn-winter of 1912, an Indian summer, and Alexandria was looking to get me out of the house, so she took it on herself to accept all the outside invitations that my grandmother had categorically rejected. My grandmother had always hidden those invitations from outside, refusing them before I could ever see them. Every Friday, Alexandria handed me 1 or 2 envelopes containing my itinerary and my tickets to yet another private girls' school that had sent money to bring me in as a special guest. Ensuring that I remained as dapper as that age allowed, she escorted me to the station wagon and watched me until I was far out of town. On weekends, I became a prisoner of travel, in exile. The routine was the same for every school. When I arrived at the station, some girls would be there to greet me, usually with a simple paper sign. They didn't know how to treat me, I didn't know how to treat them, and we all quickly discovered a lousy time together. Sometimes we walked to the school, sometimes we took a cab, and a few times we rode in a motor car. They would take me to my host family who would talk nicely to me, and to be honest, I would rather have spent time with my host than go to the dances. I'm afraid that I found girls' school girls a rather tedious lot, combining the shallowness of teens with the flightiness of women. 2 was a popular number of escorts. With 1 girl I might try something immoral, and with 3 girls there would just be too many girls in one place, so it was 2, although a third was usually picked as an alternate. Despite all the different themes that the dances professed, each dance was basically the same. Punch and snacks were at one end of a hall or a big classroom while the musicians played at the other. Meanwhile, due to my popularity, the schools would have devised a system of allocating me among the girls in some equitable way. I always said yes to these systems. To decide would have been to participate. The first and last dance usually went to my escorts. And then I danced until I was bored, and then I kept dancing. I put on my best smile, trying not to mess up the conversations too much, seeing the mismatch between the hope in their eyes and the reality in mine. I sucked life from the party. I was the one flat string on the piano, always in the key being played, droning repeatedly. Though tolerable by myself, or at least not too painful, I soured the chords around me. That didn't stop my escorts from sneaking kisses. They all tried that. A few got caught and I assume reprimanded, but most found some way to accomplish the feat. They exuded a degree of opportunism and cleverness that I thought impossible for girls. The most common tactic was for the 2 escorts to cooperate, each getting a turn while the other turned away in a coordinated misjudgment. This had the added benefit of making the second girl a lookout. All of this seemed rather spontaneous the first time, but after enough occurrences, I learned better. When it came time to go, my escorts would wait with me at the station, making all sorts of polite conversation, but less polite than when we began. By then we had lost all enjoyment in each other. As politeness dictated, they would tell me all about the wonderful time that they had had hosting me, making me promise to write back to them and exchanging addresses with me. I never saw a letter after that. Eventually we would hear a steam whistle. That was the most welcome sound that I ever knew. The train would pull in, they would give me socially acceptable kisses on the cheek, and then they would relieve themselves of my burden. Good riddance, is what their faces said. Once I was away from the station, I would curl up on the seat, exhausted, desperate to return home, but I couldn't. It was only Saturday morning. I had another ride ahead of me, another town and another dance. I considered myself lucky if the train was early, or the reception arrived at the station late. In those cases, I got time to wander about by myself a bit, poking my head around the station or the town. I liked looking. Those were moments of freedom for me, moments where I had no obligations, no duties, and no agenda. They were like those days playing at Remy's grave, where for a brief moment I was myself. My earliest memory of disease was Remy Moyneau, the son of a mathematics professor who lived near campus. My grandmother would walk me over to his house so that we could play. Remy knew nothing of math, nor history, nor wizardry. By all accounts, he was a perfectly normal child. What made him extraordinary to me was that he was my friend. We spent countless hours playing about on his perfectly rolled yard, searching for dinosaurs, fighting Indians, and pretending that we were the Wright brothers. I doubt that a grander time could happen between 2 boys. When I was 11, my grandmother sometimes let me out of her sight. She let me run over to Remy's house on Saturdays, partly because the Moyneaus were a respectable family, but mostly because they were Catholics. In those brief hours, I knew some freedom and I refused to let it go. I stayed there as long as possible, playing in those yards rather than retreat again to the prison that was our rooms. One October, when the leaves fell quick and crunchy, Remy's mother stopped me at their door. "You can't come in. Remy's sick." I went home disappointed. Having a friend sick was nothing new. I was sick sometimes too. What I failed to hear in her voice was her profound worry. There is a despair to a woman's voice that breaks you when you hear it. There is sick, and then there is sick. 3 days later, Remy died, and to this day I don't know what killed him. My grandmother only told me that he died, like one might be told that pork chops are for dinner. A few days after that, she dressed me in my best shorts and jacket and took me to his funeral. If you have ever seen a waxwork person, that is what Remy looked like. He looked so real yet unreal at the same time. At any moment he should have moved, yet he did not. During the interment, my grandmother had to keep me from climbing on the tombstones as I had no interest in the dull proceedings about me. I was finally in the churchyard where I had always wanted to be, and my opportunity to climb those monuments was at hand. My grandmother clamped herself to me to keep me from wandering off. After the funeral, I would beg her to let me visit Remy's grave, and sometimes she did, so then I would go to the churchyard to play among the tombstones. It was a Catholic graveyard, so it was allowable. After Remy's death, my grandmother clamped down on my friends. "You can't afford to get sick." She would hear no other words from me. From then on, disease was my worst enemy, hiding in plain sight around every turn. Or perhaps the disease was already inside of me, so only by living an ever more moral and virtuous life could I avoid dying from such a terrible contagion. The safest things for me were books and ink. 2 years later, in September, my grandmother came down with a cold that would not go away. On October 6th, she died of pneumonia. I would like to say that I hated her, and that I was glad that the overly rigid and domineering woman had finally gone to meet her maker, but that is not true. I cried, then I kept on crying. She lay in the coffin, looking much as she had in life, showing less emotion than a waxwork statue. That immigrant woman, that not quite beauty of Cork, that woman who only drank a small glass of sherry on Sundays, that woman who taught me how to stand proud instead of standing scared, that woman who saw my future as a redemption of her own past, that woman who bore my mother at 16, that woman who never lived a day in her life the way that she wanted, finally left this world that conflicted her so badly. She was 46 years old. While I was in the army the last year of the war, 1918, I came down with the flu. Once again, October proved a terrible month for me. The army didn't know how to deal with so many sick, so the officers were put into the infirmary, while the enlisted were sent back to their bunks to live or die as they would. At that time I was a captain, so I got some attention and pulled through. Most of us made it, but some of us didn't. Even making it, I suffered. I think that the flu was the only disease where I felt like I was going to die, because that's just how the disease made you feel. My parents didn't survive the flu. I learned later that they both died within 4 days of each other. Shameful as it is for me to admit, I did not know what became of my brothers and sisters for several decades, both because I did not contact them, and because they went into hiding after the war, terrified that the communists or the church would discover that they were my relatives. I am happy to say that most survived the flu epidemic, but saddened that the youngest, Sarah, passed away. Having been born while I was in the army, I had never met her. For me, she is but a name on a tombstone. When the truck stopped again, it was late afternoon. The thugs pulled me into a huge old Victorian hotel, forcing me up flight after flight of steps, then shoved me into a room, slamming the door behind. I sprawled onto the floor, unable to move. I was now a prisoner of my enemies, a lamb pinned by lions. I fully expected someone to come in immediately behind me, but no one came. When I realized that I could move as I pleased, I rushed into the bathroom and turned on the tap, drinking as much water as my body could hold, the brown water tasting of iron. After a while on the bathroom floor, I dared stand again. I stayed up despite my lightheadedness. I leaned in the doorway and examined my prison cell. I had been gifted with 2 blankets on the floor, a table, a chair, a typewriter, and a Catholic Bible. Those were all my creature comforts. Outside were the mountains, once forested, now bare of any and all trees. The Appalachians aren't tall mountains like the Alps, yet they are still mountains, vast stone ridges spanning a continent. Around the perimeter of the hotel, I noted rusting barbed wire and empty guard towers. One day I would learn that this was Iverson, an abandoned sanitarium in the mountains. The building and grounds had been privately developed as a pleasure retreat during the rule of Queen Victoria. Reputedly, the hot springs would aid your health. With the death of its owner in 1905, the popularity of the retreat waned in favor of other more fashionable destinations and other more popular health fads. The heirs, unable to maintain the resort, eventually closed the place up. During the war, the army had a pressing need for buildings of all sorts, so they rented the resort and repurposed it into a POW camp for German wizards. If it had been closer to a railroad track, the Bricksburg extension hadn't been completed yet, they would have turned it into a retreat for officers, but as the only thing near it was cattle farms, they decided to put prisoners there. Once inside, the only thing breaking the illusion of luxury was the peeling wallpaper, collapsed plaster, and occasional view of barbed wire. The irony was not lost on me. I was a POW in a war that I did not wish to fight. The resort was dominated by the large house that had once held guests and workers. Originally, the guests boarded in the nicest rooms, while the workers boarded in the attic and around the kitchen. Under the army, the basement quarters had been converted into a barracks, and the manager's suite had been turned into the commanding officer's quarters. Near the large building were a number of smaller buildings, mostly small private cabins, and a single larger private cabin. There was also an extensive stable for horses and carriages, and a delightful building which enclosed the hot spring. At war's end, the place had been abandoned. In 1922, a small earthquake shut down the springs, making the property utterly valueless. The owners abandoned it. Fiat Lux squatted in the place, telling all the neighbors that they were a new commune. They were the forward team, responsible for setting the place up. The neighbors bought the lie mostly because the stupidity of the project was exactly what the farmers expected out of the Communist Party. Looking down, I counted windows. I was 7, maybe 8 stories up. If I had been a good climber, I could have shimmied down somehow. I thought about sliding down a water pipe, but the closest one was 4 rooms to my right with no way over. Even if I had been so brave, down below me, sitting in a chair under a tree, sat a single thug with a shotgun. What now? I said to myself. What now?